Today we're going to just talk briefly about the definition of what an ELL is, and also what you can kind of expect as far as their English language development when they are in your classroom. We will get into the policy, federal policy with regards to our English language learners later in a couple weeks or maybe next week, but I do want to share with you the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, how they define ELLs. And for one thing, we say ELL to say English language learner. We use that term in the education arena. However, in policy making, legislation, the term is usually used limited English proficient, but they can be used pretty much synonymously. And so the No Child Left Behind Act identifies LEPs, or limited English proficient students, as those who have difficulty in the English language that's enough difficulty to deny them the ability to be successful on the state test, the state achievement tests, the ability to be successful in a classroom where language instruction is in English, and then also the ability to participate fully in society. So if the student meets any of those three criteria, then they may be labeled limited English proficient by the school. Because in our country we leave a lot of power with regards to education to the state level, there are variations in how ELLs are identified. However, typically what happens is a school will have a home language survey. My own daughter, when she went into kindergarten, I had to fill out a survey, and one of the questions was what language is spoken in the home, and I put English, so that was all that needed to be done. However, if I had put Portuguese, for example, as my brother will do when my niece goes into kindergarten, then they would give that child an English language proficiency test. Based on how they do on that proficiency test, they may or may not label them as limited English proficient. But also, it's important for you to note that teacher observations also can help the school to notice if they feel like the student needs more English language accommodations and also instruction. So you are very important in identifying needs of your students. If you notice a student may have fallen through the cracks and is not an ESL student but should be, then you need to alert the ESL teacher in your building. There are typically 5 levels of English language proficiency. Now, states vary on which programs they use, and even school districts can vary if a state hasn't adopted one. However, WIDA, W-I-D-A, is a very common program that I think over 30 states use WIDA. Pennsylvania is one of them. And so I'm using the terms used for WIDA, these entering, beginning, developing, expanding, bridging. Those come from WIDA, which you're going to learn more about WIDA later, so don't worry about that now. But there's also TESOL. Some states use TESOL instead of WIDA, and so their labels may be a little bit different. However, they also have 5 levels of English language proficiency, so they look pretty similar. So don't worry if you end up in a state that's not using WIDA, you'll be able to pick up on the different levels quickly as well. So these are levels that students may, we kind of categorize the ELLs as they come to us, and then they move through these levels as they continue to grow in their English language proficiency. So a student at the entering level is one in which they may not talk at all, so they are in what we call the silent period. And so this is an important term for you to know, so I'm writing it in here for you with a cursor, so sorry if it looks like kindergarten writing. The silent period. So that means that they're not really producing language yet. And you don't need to be alarmed by that. You do want to still, don't pretend they're invisible in your classroom. You still need to work with them and try to help them to understand what it is you're teaching in your class. But that being said, know that they may not be able to produce much for you yet. They can last in this period for maybe 1 or 2 months, and then hopefully they're going to move into the beginning stage. And in the beginning stage, they're able to start articulating in short phrases or one-word or two-word answers, so they can answer basic words or basic questions. Developing, they're really able to start using and producing the language with longer phrases and complete sentences, but they still may struggle to completely express what they know. So a lot of scaffolds still need to happen in these first 3 stages. When students reach expanding, a lot of their errors are mostly due to style or usage. So you can do a lot of the same things with them that you're doing with your native speakers. However, you might want to adjust your grading accordingly, because understanding that they are still in the expanding stage of their English proficiency. And then the last stage before they get redesignated out of the ESL program is bridging. And this is where they may still struggle, especially with writing, I found as an English teacher. They could read well and understand, but their writing, English is a very difficult language to learn, with our grammar rules that have exceptions constantly, the spelling with exceptions, spelling coming from so many different countries. And so they still may need some support, especially with writing, even if they sound fluent. Redesignation is when the student, the ESL teacher, feels like they have moved through all 5 of these stages successfully and they're ready to be redesignated out of the ESL program. And so then they would be designated as Fluent English Proficient, FEP. To help you understand what students may show up in your classroom and what level they're at, I just wanted to kind of share this with you. These are typical transitions to content areas for each level of English language proficiency. So oftentimes when a student comes to us, even in the silent period, they will be placed in art, music, and PE with regular ed students, and then they'll spend the rest of their time in an ESL classroom. If they are in the beginning, so that's just using very short phrases, 1 or 2 word answers, they may already be in math and science, because they're able to do math computation in science labs. They can move on to in developing, again, science and math. So if you teach science or math, you really have to be ready to provide scaffolds for these second and third stages here. They're going to need a lot of accommodations. And so if you teach music, you're going to need to give a lot of accommodations for your entering students as well as any of the others. If you teach English, they do tend to be more proficient and they're in language development, because they spend the English class period in ESL, in their ESL classroom. And so they don't move into the regular English language arts class until expanding, bridging, or being redesignated. The same with social studies as well. Think about why schools would move students into the regular ed classrooms at this pace, and we'll talk about that in class. And then I have to give you a caveat though. This is what I'm sharing with you with the typical transitions into the content areas is kind of best practice. It's what works best for students. However, school districts don't necessarily always go by best practice. For example, a school district in Western PA where I was observing student teacher in social studies had a Chinese student who was still in his silent period in his social studies classroom. So that student teacher really needed to have a lot of scaffolds, accommodations for that student who was in an entering stage, but was trying to learn social studies still. When placing ELL students, when they're first arriving into your school, we can have some challenges as well when considering whether they have other special education needs. So some ELLs that come into your classroom may have learning disabilities as well, and so it's really difficult but important to make the distinction between language difficulties that any ELL is going to have versus cognitive learning disabilities that are going to require special education services. So it's important for, if you are a special educator, it's important for you to work with the bilingual or ESL educators to work together to assess the student on whether it's a language issue or a cognitive learning disability, so that they get the support that they need to be able to grow and be successful. Added to that complication, sometimes you may have students who have been refugees or have been migrant in a migrant family, where the students have limited or interrupted formal education. You may hear that referred to as SLIFE in some of the research. And so those students may have huge gaps in their education. For example, they may be coming to you at age 13 but only have through 4th grade education, and so but yet they you can't just push them into special ed because they may not have a learning disability, and so that means that the classroom teacher is going to need to make a lot of accommodations and differentiation for that student to be able to grow and be and progress in their education and in their English development, to fill in some of those holes that they may have in their education from either refugee status or just missing parts of their educational experience. So when we come to class, at our next class, you're going to have a chance to try to identify, based on some characteristics of students, what level of proficiency you would put them in. So we'll talk about that and also answer any questions that you may have on this little bit of information I've shared with you now. Have a great night.